Hello, this is Urbanism from the Left, and you are watching our first video, which is called Red Vienna and Its Legacy. Can we win the rights of the city under capitalism? Over the past few decades, housing costs in major cities across the world have exploded. In the United States, the median monthly rent in 2019 was $1,541 in Washington, D.C., $1,620 in Boston, and a whopping $1,895 in San Francisco, which is unaffordable for lower income and even some middle income people. Rents are extremely high and rising in major cities across the world, from London and Paris to Hong Kong and Sydney. One city that appears on the surface to be an exception to this trend, however, is the city of Vienna, Austria. Austria's capital city, Vienna, is known today for its widespread affordable housing, with around 50% of all residents living in either municipally owned housing units or in cooperative apartments built with municipal subsidies. The high number of social housing units is likely the reason why Vienna has lower rents than many other European cities, including similarly sized cities like Lisbon and Rotterdam. Vienna's social housing construction began in the period from 1919 to 1934, when the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Austria, or the SDAPO for short, governed the city. This was known as the Red Vienna period. The party used taxes on wealthy Viennese residents to fund social programs, including the construction of almost 64,000 municipal apartment units across the city. The purpose of these programs was not just to alleviate issues faced by residents, such as the housing shortage in the city. It was part of a socialist vision for Vienna that would ultimately overthrow capitalism and create a truly just and thriving city. The SDAPO was a Marxist party inspired by the example of the Bolsheviks in Russia, although they had some political disagreements with them. Unlike the Bolsheviks, they did not attempt to lead a revolution in Austria because they did not believe they had enough support from the populace for such a revolution to be successful. Instead, they enacted reforms within a capitalist framework. The SDAPO was overthrown by the Austro-Fascists in 1934, but it regained a majority of seats in the municipal council after the end of World War II. It built tens of thousands of municipal apartments in the post-war period, but by the 1990s, the construction of social housing had largely ended, although cooperative housing units owned by nonprofits continued to be subsidized by the city government. In this video, I will explore the legacy of Red Vienna and the socialist vision that produced it, and how this legacy has come into conflict with market forces as the city and national government increasingly embrace the political ideology of neoliberalism starting in the 1980s. Red Vienna serves as a case study for how socialism can increase the rights of the city of everyday residents within the confines of the existing capitalist system, and it reveals the limitations of such a project as well. The history of Vienna demonstrates that many of the reforms desired by those of a socialist vision for their city are achievable through mass movements of working people, but it is also a testament to the fragility of these reforms as they are constantly threatened by a system rooted in profit for a few rather than in improving the lives of the many. Part 1. Neoliberalism and the Rights of a City. The concept of neoliberalism was popularized in the 1980s by academics such as the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who observed a shift away from a welfare state toward a supposedly quote-unquote free market economy that was happening in North America and Europe at the time. It was being imposed on poorer countries throughout the world by North American and European powers. Neoliberalism essentially means an obsession with a quote-unquote free market as the best way to achieve sustained economic growth and technological progress, and the belief that there should be minimal state intervention in economic and social affairs, except, ironically, to subsidize and even bail out private companies. Proponents of neoliberalism oppose nearly all forms of government intervention that help working people, and they support government austerity and privatization. The rights of a city is a concept introduced by French Marxist Henri Lefebvre in 1968. It has since been promoted by influential Marxist urban theorists, including Peter Marcuse and David Harvey. It offers an alternative to the dominant neoliberal vision of urban politics. The rights of a city is essentially defined by Lefebvre, Marcuse, and Harvey as the right of a working and marginalized people who make up a vast majority of urban residents to have power over their own cities and communities. Proponents of a right to a city have argued that everyone should be able to live and spend time in all parts of a city. Currently, cities across the world are becoming increasingly unaffordable for many as neighborhoods experience widespread gentrification. Gentrifying parts of cities are actively losing the businesses that cater to their poorer residents, in many ways having their pre-gentrification cultural landscapes erased by both private and state actors. This process is dramatically visible in global urban hubs or neighborhoods like the East Village in Williamsburg in New York and Soho in London have experienced dramatic transformations. These communities were once home to lower income residents and often to communities marginalized on the basis of race, sexuality, and or ethnicity, but they have increasingly lost these residents and become economically and culturally homogenous. It is now very difficult for lower income urban residents to live or even spend time in certain neighborhoods, while other parts of the same cities continue to struggle with poverty and disinvestment. Another Marxist urban theorist named Neil Smith described the phenomenon of certain urban neighborhoods gentrifying and homogenizing, while others become increasingly poor and disinvested as one manifestation of a process of uneven development under capitalism. Uneven development describes how areas of a world develop in ways that are unequal and often nonlinear in terms of economic, technological, and cultural development. It can be applied to the national or regional level or at the local level, as Neil Smith did. In Red Vienna, the city's workers came much closer than the working people of almost any city today to winning the right to the city. They were governed by a party that strived to achieve this through various reforms, and they were able to have more influence over the SDAPO government than they would have had over any pro-capitalist government. But to what degree have the progressive reforms of the Red Vienna period survived today? What does the legacy of Red Vienna tell us about how much working people can win improvements to their lives under capitalism, and if it is possible for these improvements to survive against the inevitable neoliberal attacks on them? Part 2, the Socialist Project of Red Vienna. The first series of major reforms in Vienna that helped working people, children, and the elderly came during the Red Vienna period from 1919 to 1934. This was the first period when the SDAPO had near total political control over Vienna, and it used its power to implement some major social reforms and programs. By 1920, over 450,000 Viennese workers had become members of the socialist free trade unions, and over 100,000 Viennese workers had gone on strike in January 1918 as part of a strike wave for peace across the dying country of Austria-Hungary, not long before the First World War ended and Austria-Hungary was broken up. Union activism was crucial in the post-war period since the city faced major economic and social problems, including a massive housing shortage, significant inflation that deepened the economic problems of many residents, and undernourishment for many poorer residents. These issues were addressed at the national level when SDAPO leader Karl Renner was briefly the first chancellor of Austria from 1918 to 1920, but a member of a conservative Christian Social Party was elected to replace him in 1920. Despite the relatively short period of SDAPO control, the party implemented a number of nationwide reforms, including unemployment benefits, the 8-hour workday, regulations on the working conditions of various groups, including child laborers, and the law ensuring the right to collective bargaining. They also implemented universal suffrage, giving all adult citizens the right to vote. From 1921 to 1932, the SDAPO was not part of Austria's governing coalition, and members of a conservative Christian Social Party held the chancellorship for the majority of this period. The Social Democrats remained the governing party in Vienna, however, and they implemented major reforms, including the opening of new kindergartens and after-school centers, free medical and dental examinations offered by schools, and the opening of public bathing facilities to promote hygiene. These reforms resulted in the quality of life benefits for Viennese workers and their children, including a 50% decrease in infant mortality. Perhaps the most impressive achievement of this period was the construction of almost 64,000 public housing units, typically built in sizable blocks with various amenities for residents. They included the famed Karl Marx Hof complex, which still stands today. The SDAPO also implemented strict rent regulations. It funded these programs and initiatives through taxes imposed on luxury goods and a progressive housing tax. These achievements were made possible by the relatively high levels of political consciousness and propensity for militant action that many Viennese workers had at the time. Although these reforms were positive, Red Vienna was still far from a utopia for working people and marginalized residents. Thanks in part to the onset of the Great Depression, there were an estimated 77,000 people spending time in Viennese homeless shelters each month by the end of the Red Vienna period, and many homes of poorer workers did not have gas, electricity, or running water. In addition to those who suffered from homelessness or low-quality housing, many poor Viennese residents settled in informal shanty towns on the outskirts of the city after the First World War, and many continued living in these communities throughout the Red Vienna period. But these problems could have only been solved through even more ambitious programs, since the private market was not building the new housing that was needed. And the new units that the city government did build were relatively high quality, as there were mandates that each unit must have its own bathroom, water, gas, and electricity, be well lit, and have easy access to a street or courtyard. The housing built during this period was fairly diverse in terms of both architectural style and building type. Most of the units built were in apartment buildings, which ranged from small structures with just a few apartments to massive complexes with sizable courtyards and hundreds of units, such as the Karl Marx Hof. They also included some row houses and even semi-detached suburban-style housing. The larger apartment blocks often had extensive amenities for residents, including communal laundry centers, playrooms for children, workshop space, shops, and even swimming pools. The typical housing unit may not have been very large, but it offered a much better living experience than the extremely cramped, slum-like conditions in which many poor residents had previously lived. Throughout its existence, Red Vienna met opposition from conservative coalitions that controlled the Austrian government beginning in 1921. In order to defend the Republic against the increasing far-right and in many cases fascist threat, the SDAPO formed a nationwide paramilitary organization called the Republikanischer Schutzbund in 1923. However, the SDAPO leadership refused to allow the Schutzbund to use force to resist the dissolution of the parliament by the fascist chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss in 1933, and although there was some rebellion when the fascists fully took over Vienna in 1934, this came in spite of the actions of the SDAPO. Red Vienna was an effort by the SDAPO to create a base for the establishment of a socialist Austria unified with Germany. According to the historian Helmut Gruber, it was an attempt to create, quote, a foretaste of a socialist utopia of a future in the present by locating the beginning of a transformation leading to a new socialist humanity within capitalist society itself before the ultimate revolution. It is reminiscent of the visions and reform efforts of the socialists and communists in many countries across the world who were often at their strongest point in terms of support and actual political power, or quickly growing stronger around this time. Part 3, Post-War Housing Policy and the Shift Toward Neoliberalism. The SDAPO, which was renamed the Socialist Party of Austria, or SPO, after World War II, regained governments in Vienna after the war, and it has governed the city up to the present, although it is now called the Social Democratic Party of Austria, also SPO. The SPO was also part of coalition governments for most of the period from 1945 to 2017. Its members sometimes held the chancellorship, but it only governed without being in a coalition with the Conservative Party from 1970 to 1983. After the war, SPO leaders largely abandoned their socialist visions and instead focused on maintaining political stability. However, they did continue to build both public and subsidized housing across the country, including in Vienna. One notable Viennese public housing project from the post-war years is the Alterweg complex, which consists of 3 rows of high-rise apartment buildings surrounded by green space, built between 1968 and 1985. It was directly inspired by the architect and urban designer Le Corbusier's radiant city model, and it reflects a radically different way of living from the traditional low to mid-rise apartment buildings constructed during the Red Vienna period. By the 1990s, however, the rate of construction of public housing was falling in Vienna, and the city has relied entirely on nonprofits for the provision of social housing since 2004. The nonprofit-owned apartments do not charge higher rents on average than government-owned apartments, but they do require a down payment to move in. These down payments can be fairly high, ranging from 450 to 550 euros per square meter in 2010, or about 25,000 US dollars for a modest apartment. The city does provide low-interest loans that can cover the cost of a down payment, but that does not fully solve the affordability problem. The regulated private rental market, which makes up about 2/3 of Vienna's private rental units as of 2011, has also been liberalized since the mid-1980s through the replacement of unlimited rental contracts with the possibility for fixed-term contracts. New regulations increase rents for better equipped housing units with modern amenities. And for units located in prime locations, renters must pay hundreds of euros extra per month. Partly as a result of these changes, rent increases in regulated private units were almost twice as high as the overall rent increase between 2001 and 2010, and the share of households in the private rental market that spend more than 25% of their income on housing costs rose from 39% to 45% between 2005 and 2011. Conclusion. The legacy of Red Vienna is still visible today in the thousands of apartments built by the government during then that still stand and are still used as social housing. The Red Vienna period doubtlessly set a precedent for the embrace of social housing and regulation of a private market by the city in later decades, which continues today. However, Vienna and the SPO have not been immune to the political and economic pressures of neoliberalism. The city does seem to be in a process of gradual deregulation of the private market, and it has completely abandoned the construction of new public housing. As the pressures of population growth and the city's popularity with tourists lead to rising land values and housing costs, it is becoming increasingly unaffordable to live in Vienna, especially in its most central neighborhoods, even as the city continues to have one of the most decommodified housing portfolios in Europe. Only time will tell whether Vienna and Austria as a whole will embrace more radical neoliberal reforms. However, it seems unlikely that any of these privatization trends will be reversed in the near future, especially if there continues to be widespread support for the conservative Austrian People's Party, which has held the chancellorship for most of the period from December 2017 to the present. There has even been a disturbingly high level of support for the far-right Freedom Party in recent years. And the country already has high wealth inequality. Austria has had a wealth Gini coefficient of 0.739 in 2021 compared to 0.746 for the highly unequal UK and 0.852 for the even more unequal United States. Red Vienna exemplifies the promise of transformative urban reform, but also shows us its temporal limitations. It began a process through which Vienna achieved one of the most decommodified housing markets that exists in any capitalist country. But the fact that even in Vienna, the housing regulations are gradually being relaxed and the public housing stock has completely stopped growing shows that under capitalism, reforms that help working people are almost always in danger of being rolled back as they meet harsh resistance from landlords, business owners, and other relatively powerful groups. Red Vienna shows us that it is possible to guarantee foundational components of a right to the city, such as affordable housing, to virtually everyone under capitalism, although it is admittedly easier to do this in wealthier countries. However, it also shows that there needs to be some permanent form of mass organization for working people and marginalized groups in order to defend these gains against the attacks they will inevitably face sooner or later. Perhaps most importantly, it shows that whenever socialists manage to achieve real political power within a capitalist system, they will always be in a vulnerable position and will need to be protected through mass action. This is demonstrated not just by the experience of Red Vienna, but by the experience of socialists who attained political power without overthrowing capitalism throughout the world and were brutally overthrown and assassinated by reactionary pro-capitalist forces in their own country, often with the backing of imperialist powers like the United States, including Salvador Allende in Chile and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Red Vienna shows that transformative progressive reforms are possible under capitalism, but in our neoliberal era where unions in most countries are far weaker than they were just 40 years ago, and most major social democratic and labor parties have increasingly embraced neoliberalism, returning to the model of city organization that projects like Red Vienna created will require massive long-term mobilizations of working people and youth on national and even global scales. And at a time when we are facing the existential threat of climate change and the global economic collapse that could eventually cause even the achievement of cities and countries modeled after Red Vienna across the world might not be enough to solve the problems that capitalism has created. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. Like this video and subscribe for more videos on urban topics from a leftist perspective. Here are some of the books and articles that I consulted for this video. The best English language book on Red Vienna is arguably Red Vienna, Experiment in Working Class Culture, 1919 and 1934 by Helmut Gruber. It offers a comprehensive overview of the policies and politics of this period, although Gruber does have a bit of an anti-communist bias. One article on Red Vienna that provides a good short overview of the period is a piece published in Jacobin magazine called Remembering Red Vienna. Another Jacobin article called The Propaganda of Construction is also a good read. Some good articles on Austria's shift toward neoliberal housing policy are the older article, What Kind of Privatization? The Case of Social Housing in Vienna, Austria, and the newer articles, Recommodifying Housing Informally, quote-unquote, Red Vienna, and Housing Vienna, the socio-spatial effects of inclusionary and exclusionary mechanisms of social housing provision. To learn more about neoliberalism, I recommend starting with YouTuber Baden Banada's video called Neoliberalism Explained, Its Theory, Practice, and Consequences. Books on neoliberalism that I recommend, although I've only read small sections of them, are A Short History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey, The New Way of the World on Neoliberal Society by Pierre Dardel and Christian Louval, and Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, How Neoliberalism Survived a Financial Meltdown by Philip Morawski. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you'll be able to see another video from this channel soon.